I'm here at Manchester Cathedral, an historic building in the heart of the city. It took over 600 years for the cathedral to evolve into what you see here today. What sort of words might be used to describe a cathedral? Well, first and foremost, it's a centre of religion where many people come to worship. It's also a place for reflection and contemplation, and even sanctuary. It's an oasis of peace. The scenes you just saw are from a computer game, Resistance: Fall of Man. Those scenes are set here, in the heart of Manchester Cathedral. When the game was released in 2007, the use of the cathedral as a setting for violence and bloodshed sparked a major controversy. A war of words began between the game's producers, Sony, and the church. The church argued that the game damaged the reputation of the cathedral as a place of learning, prayer, and heritage. Sony countered by suggesting that the footage of the cathedral was like any footage used in science fiction entertainment. Doctor Who, for example. So who was right? Was it okay to use images of this sacred building for such a purpose? Or was the building violated by being depicted in an aggressive game? This type of ethical dilemma is increasingly found in some areas of computing. If a subject, whether it's a person, money, or in this case a building, is virtual, not real, is there actually a moral issue? In the case of Manchester Cathedral versus Sony, there are a number of ethical questions that can be posed, and both sides have important points to raise. The Dean of the Cathedral, the Very Reverend Rogers Morgan Govender, is clear in his opinion that the game actually harmed the reputation of the cathedral.
The cathedral, and I guess any church, is a place where people come to meet with God, to pray. People come here seeing it as a sanctuary, a place where they can deal with their issues, perhaps remember loved ones, or perhaps remember a marriage or an ordination or a baptism or a funeral taking place here, or perhaps a special service. In this case, my objection to this game came from the fact that we have a service here on a regular basis, once a year at least, where the cathedral is packed with families of victims of murder and manslaughter here in the city. And people come to remember loved ones killed violently. And so the cathedral is a place where people come to think, to pray, find peace. And depicting the cathedral in this violent video game was totally against the grain of what this place stands for and what people come here to do. And of course that connects with the community as well, because the community objected and supported me in my objection, because they were able to understand and able to support the church, because many of them have lost their own children in violent gun crime here in this very city. Gang warfare in this city has been rife for many years, and young people especially being killed by guns is a particular problem in Manchester. So both the church and the community objected to this game primarily for these reasons.
The points made by the church and its supporters give compelling reasons why Sony shouldn't have used images of the cathedral. So what was Sony's initial reaction?
Resistance: Fall of Man is a fantasy science fiction game and is not based on reality. We believe we have sought and received all permissions necessary for the creation of the game.
Later, Sony admitted that it didn't seek permission from the cathedral. Whether it actually needed to is a grey area. Whilst in theory the cathedral is owned by the church, which also owns the intellectual property of that building, including rights over the use of images of it, there was no actual prosecution of Sony for using those images. Unsurprisingly, most comments on gaming sites suggested that players knew there was no realism involved, as the shootouts were with aliens. However, there were comments that if it were the Vatican, the Catholic Church would be equally offended. The cathedral itself also observed that the issue may have been viewed differently if it were a mosque or synagogue that had been used. What do people working within the games industry feel about the moral issues involved?
Well, I think it's perfectly okay for Resistance to have used Manchester Cathedral's interior and exterior images. It did it for a very specific reason. It went for a very specific location. It picked Manchester Cathedral as a landmark, and narratively and symbolically within the game it means something. It's not a random location chosen from a hat. And absolutely, I think the makers of the game had the right to do that. I think the big mistake they made was not informing the church. I think that could have been handled better. The moral side of it is a grey area, I think. It very much comes down to personal opinion. My personal opinion would be that you should be allowed to represent anywhere in the world you want in a video game and use it for any purpose. Obviously, the bit where it becomes a very murky area indeed would be in the instance of the Columbine school shootings, where it's well known that one of the killers made his own levels for a very popular game called Doom, one of which recreated his school's interior. And there have been other instances of similar user modifications for existing games. Obviously, in those circumstances where someone is creating something they have a personal investment and a geographical proximity to, there is a very hazy line there, I think. But in terms of big publisher-created video games made for the major consoles, none of them ever approached that, and I think Resistance was perfectly right to do what it did.
In a letter to the Dean, Sony argued there was no connection between
contemporary issues of 21st century Manchester and a work of science fiction in which a fictitious 1950s Britain is under attack by aliens.
This highlights the question of fictional representation, rather than moving images. What if it was a painting that showed a shooting in the cathedral, or simply a description in a novel? Religious buildings are frequently used in fiction and are not always represented in a good moral light. Paganism, infidelity and death are woven into William Golding's novel The Spire, which is based around Salisbury Cathedral. Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose includes murder and sex within a Benedictine monastery. Such fictional representations doesn't seem to attract controversy. Is this because works of art and literature are deemed more worthy than a computer game? If so, then what about a popular film like The Da Vinci Code? Part of this was shot at Lincoln Cathedral after Westminster Abbey refused filming permission. Interestingly, the cathedral reputedly received £100,000 as a location fee. In Manchester, Sony issued a full-page apology in the Manchester Evening News.
It was never our intention to offend anyone in the making of this game, and we would like to apologise unreservedly to them for causing that offence, and to all parts of the community who we might also have offended.
This was not deemed to be sufficient by the church, who wanted the game withdrawn. Sony refused. The debate continued later in the year when the game was nominated for a BAFTA award. One church official said that this was like rubbing salt in the wounds. Neither Sony nor BAFTA responded to demands to remove the game from the awards. The game didn't win. Sony's main defence in its use of the cathedral was that since the game is clearly fictional and takes place in virtual space, nothing has been done to the actual fabric of the cathedral. Does virtual desecration count in the same way as tangible desecration?
In terms of desecration of the cathedral, I think we need to try and understand whether there are, in fact, any links between things virtual and things real. Now, we know that very often people go and watch movies, for instance, because a movie depicts life in one way or another, or raises some of the issues about life. A video game, very often people translate what they see or engage in interactively with a video game into real life. There are stories, there are reports in the press, and if one goes into the press archives, even the recent archives, you will find stories of people who've been killed because somebody watched this happen on a game or played it in a video game and acted it out in reality. People have actually lost their lives because somebody has acted out what they've seen in a video game. And that in itself is a desecration of the place because of what a cathedral, certainly any cathedral and our cathedral no less, it stands for. It's about the sanctity of life. It is about holiness. It is about respect for others, and not simply living in a virtual world, because we live in a real world, not a virtual world.
I think virtual desecration and tangible desecration are two very, very different things, and I think it's also always worth bearing in mind that what one person thinks is desecration, another person finds perfectly acceptable, if not veneration. In this particular example, a church has certain, very specific associations that have been built up over a long, long time. And that means anyone using a church in any piece of media knows those associations and can either use them, go alongside it, or they can turn them around and use it to make a kind of opposite point. Video games, absolutely, I believe that they should have the right to do that within their own virtual spaces. And the example I would give in support of that is a game that was announced early in 2009 called 6 Days in Fallujah, which was about a conflict during the Iraq War, which was very nasty. About 6,000 civilians died. And when this game was announced, pretty much only its title and its subject matter was announced, but it caused a kind of public furore to such an extent that the publisher of the game withdrew its support, and now the developer is on its last legs, and it's looking very likely that game won't get made at all. That was obviously an attempt to comment on a very specific contemporary issue in an intelligent manner in a video game, and it's been stopped. I think that shows perfectly what Manchester Cathedral is showing on slightly a smaller scale, which is that freedom of representation for video games is a huge part of, if not as important as, freedom of speech.
On the upside for both parties, this very public, ethical disagreement generated free publicity, leading to increased sales of the game and extra visitors for the cathedral. It's still debatable whether Sony was legally wrong to use visuals of Manchester Cathedral in the game, but the main debate here is whether Sony was morally wrong to use the visuals of the cathedral. What's your opinion?